The U.S. is shoring up its military command in Japan. Washington says that's to counter growing threats from China, North Korea, and Russia. But is this a realistic deterrent? Or could it provoke more tension in an already volatile region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The United States says it's revamping its military command in Japan as the two countries face what they call the greatest strategic challenge from China. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says it's the most significant change since the military alliance was formed 70 years ago. Washington and Tokyo say they're increasingly concerned by what they call an evolving security environment. They accuse China of engaging in coercive behaviour to change the status quo in the East and South China Seas, around Taiwan and throughout the region. The revamp comes as China is expanding its nuclear arsenal and Russia is strengthening military ties with North Korea. How will this agreement change the security relationship between the U.S. and Japan? And how will China respond? We'll discuss all that in a moment, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
Chinese military drills held around Taiwan. Beijing believes the self-governed island is part of China and reunification is inevitable. It's not ruled out taking Taiwan by force. The US and Japan say such joint sea and air exercises are an example of China's increasingly aggressive behaviour around the island, as well as in the East and South China Sea. They describe the People's Republic of China, or PRC, as the greatest strategic threat facing the region.
We strongly oppose the PRC's efforts to unilaterally change the status quo by force in the East China Sea and the South China Sea around Taiwan. We agree on the importance of upholding peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
Japan hosts more than 50,000 US troops that take their orders from America's Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. But that's more than 6,000 kilometers away and 19 hours behind Japan. The two countries have announced a revamped joint command and control structure that changes that.
Now, this will be the most significant change to U.S. Forces Japan since its creation, and one of the strongest improvements in our military ties with Japan in 70 years.
The changes come as China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. But Washington and Tokyo are also worried about Russia's renewed defense ties with Pyongyang.
We reaffirmed our call for the complete denuclearization of North Korea, and we also shared our concerns about Russia and North Korea's military cooperation.
For Japan, the agreement with the US marks a significant shift from decades of pacifism since World War II.
It's been a shift which has been a bit of a time coming, but essentially the flexibility of interpretation of the so-called pacifist constitution is allowing for this greater expansion of a potential role for the Japanese self-defense forces in the region.
Critics say the bolstering of US military bases in East Asia is likely to be seen as a threat by some countries and further escalate tensions in an already volatile region. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, a leading Chinese think tank. In Tokyo, Tomohiko Taniguchi is a special advisor at the Fujitsu Future Studies Center. And in Singapore, Evan Laxmana is an editor at the Institute for Strategic Studies. He also researches Indo-Pacific defense and strategy. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Tomohiko, let me start with you today. How significant is this strengthening of the military alliance between the U.S. and Japan, and how will it change the security relationship between both countries?
It has actually been a very long time coming because Japan, despite the fact it's got 3 services of military, there has never been a joint operations command. In other words, Japanese services have lacked its nerve center. Japan is building its nerve center, and the United States has now concluded that it is going to build and establish the corresponding command as a theater command, looking after not only Japan, but also in this part of the world. Because as your reporter noted, that U.S. Indo-Pacific Command is too far away, and quick response is very much necessary. There has got to be a revamping of the U.S. command structure corresponding to the similar changes that have been taking place in Japan, and both to expand and reaffirm and strengthen the joint deterrence capabilities, certainly vis-a-vis China.
Victor, so the U.S. and Japan describe the People's Republic of China as the greatest strategic threat facing the region. How will China be responding to all of this in the near and the long term?
I think the 2+2 meetings in Tokyo and the so-called revamping of the U.S. command in Japan are real evidence to show that the Biden administration will be recorded by history as a Cold War administration. And people like Blinken and the Secretary of Defense are Cold Warriors. Fortunately, they are on their way out. And I think by January 2025, they will be gone into oblivion. Because if Donald Trump wins the election, they will all be gone. And if Kamala Harris wins the election, she most likely will revamp the State Department and the Secretary Department of Defense completely. Fortunately, this visit is the last hurrah of the Cold War administration under President Biden. Therefore, I think we need to emphasize one point, that people in this part of the world does not need a Cold War, because people do not want to have war. We want to have peace and stability and cooperation. To single out China as an enemy is completely misjudged. China is a staunch force for peace. China is a staunch force for promoting global trade. China is the largest trading nation in the world. China is the largest trading partner with more than 130 nations in the world, including Japan, amazingly. Therefore, if any country to single out China as an enemy, it definitely demonstrates they are either insane or they are completely out of their mind. Misjudgment in the most dangerous form.
Evan, you heard Victor there talk about the specter of the U.S. presidential election coming up in November. And I want to ask you about how that looms over all of this when it comes to the U.S.'s allies in the region. Is there a sense of worry about what were to happen when it comes to this agreement and other potential alliances if Donald Trump is reelected to a second term? And what exactly the stance will be from Kamala Harris if she is elected as the next president of the U.S.?
I think certainly there is momentum to institutionalize and deepen existing arrangements before a new administration comes in. And we say this whether it's about long-term programs like AUKUS with Australia and the UK, or in what we've seen in terms of its alliances with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. So it is certainly in the minds of policymakers in the region and among U.S. allies that regardless of who becomes the new president, we need to institutionalize as much as we could, as deep as we could, so that whoever comes next wouldn't be able to change all of these things just because he or she would like to. And this brings us to the issue of Kamala Harris. I do think that she will likely bring in some of the veteran foreign policy hands, whether in the State Department or at the Defense Department, and likely those who are familiar with Asia as well. So to some extent, if Kamala wins, I think we would like to see perhaps a lot more continuity with the Biden administration. And yet, I do think the tone and style perhaps might be a bit different. I think the reality of the regional security is as such that some of the momentum that we see on the U.S. ally side of things may not carry into the non-U.S. alliance part of the security relationship, particularly in countries in Southeast Asia. And this is where the U.S. needs to do more work to convince the rest of the region that it is seeking regional stability and peace.
And Evan, if we're talking about geopolitics, I want to ask you, what are the strategic implications of the U.S. shoring up its military command in Japan?
I think it's certainly big in terms of interoperability with Japan. We've seen this progress as well with U.S. allies in other places. So the need to have interoperability is a key component for the U.S.'s ability to deter any regional conflict, whether it's involving China or other countries. So certainly that step with Japan is a significant one and should not be underestimated. However, I do think that when it comes to regional peace and stability, there are concerns outside of U.S. allies, particularly in countries in the region who are not U.S. allies. What happens to them? Are we witnessing a two-floor regional security architecture where the U.S. and its allies are the top building and those who are not U.S. allies at the lower floor? What happens if they cannot work better with U.S. and its allies? So I do think that the momentum that's been going very well on the U.S. And its allies may not carry over in terms of the rest of the region. And this is where concerns about regional tension and contingency planning comes in, because not everyone has the luxury of its alliance with the United States.
Tomohiko, I want to look for a moment at sort of the backdrop of what's going on, some of the issues at play in Japan right now, because this reconfiguration of the security relationship between the U.S. and Japan, this comes at a time when, Japan has been shifting its defense posture. In recent years, Japan has really shifted dramatically from decades of post-war pacifism, right?
Yes and no. No, because if you look at the amount of defense budget, which has certainly increased compared to what it was like 30 years ago, Japanese defense spending has grown by 27%, whereas Chinese defense budget has grown during the same period of 30 years, 3,500%, meaning 35 times as large as it was. So Japan should certainly strengthen its deterrence capabilities, but there is a keen awareness Japan could do nothing alone by itself, which is why Japan is very much paying much attention to strengthening its alliance relationships and partners with the United States, Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India, and so on and so forth.
Victor, Moscow has bolstered its ties with Beijing in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. How much is all of that playing into this?
Thank you very much for asking this very important question. But allow me to add one point very quickly first. I think what the United States and Japan are talking about are in violation of the Japanese constitution, which prohibits the deployment of Japanese forces outside of Japan. Therefore, it is illegal as far as this constitution violation is concerned. And I think people in Japan should really wake up and call on their government to take the right measure rather than being hijacked onto the bandwagon of the United States in its pursuit of geopolitical dominance. People and the countries in the world today do not want to be dominated. If Japan says it wants to be dominated by the United States, which bombed 2 cities with nuclear weapons, be my guest. Now, you talked about China-Russian relations. China and Russia share 4,300 kilometers long of border. And the border has been peaceful ever since 1991, when Russia became independent. And we treasure this peace and tranquility and cooperation along the China-Russian border. And we consider this tranquil, peaceful border as one of the most important pillars of overall Eurasian stability. And China and Russia are dealing with each other as normal neighbors and countries which want to promote each other's business and trading relations. China does not recognize the war in Ukraine as a legitimate war. China wants to have this war achieving ceasefire and wrapped up as quickly as possible. China has always been talking to Russia on the one hand and Ukraine on the other hand about the absolute necessity of ending the war and China does not provide any weapon of any kind to either Russia or to Ukraine. Therefore, I think history will put China on the right side of history as the only significant country in the world today to constantly calling for peace and ceasefire and ending hostilities in this war so that more lives can be saved, both in Russia as well as in Ukraine. Prolonging the war is the wrong thing to do. And I think probably Donald Trump has the right thing to say that if he's elected, he will end the war in 24 hours. I hope he will be able to deliver that as he promised.
Tomohiko, Victor there was saying that from his standpoint, he believed that this agreement violated the Constitution in Japan. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that or wanted to respond.
Well, I would like to say that Japan needs to change its constitution to make it happen, as Mr. Gao has mentioned, for the nation to deliver troops outside the nation. But Japan's constitution so far has enabled Japanese armed forces to defend the nation, only the nation. Japan cannot do anything that Australia has been doing all the time with its alliance partner, the United States. So Mr. Gao may have his own interpretation of Japanese constitution, but there's been no discussion whatsoever in Japan to deliver Japanese troops outside of its country.
Evan, I had asked Victor about concerns about Russia's deepening ties with China, how that is playing into it. Let me ask you, how worried are the U.S. and Japan about Russia's renewed defense ties with North Korea, and how much is that playing into this?
I think certainly the renewal of Russian-North Korean ties is a source of concern for European countries as well as the United States. They have thought that with supplies of all kinds of ammunition and other equipment from DPRK to Russia, that will allow Russia to prolong the war and certainly make things a lot more harder to find that particular ceasefire that we've discussed earlier. However, I think the issue around North Korea is also becoming a lot more complicated, not just in terms of its support to Russia, but also its belligerent behavior in the region as well. So in that sense, the nexus or the convergence between North Korea, Russia, and China does add the sense of urgency, I think, among U.S. and its allies to sustain the momentum in terms of closing the gaps of interoperability, enhancing capabilities, but also finding new ways to collaborate in terms of defense industrial assistance programs, resilience, and others. So I do think the urgency has grown precisely because of Russia's ability to sustain itself now in the war and grow its partnership with North Korea. But I do think the relationship between Russia, North Korea, and China itself, I think, remains particularly uncertain. We know that there is a pragmatic relationship at this point between the three, but I'm not entirely convinced that that between the three, the relationship is an equal and an enduring one. So I do think, yes, it adds the urgency, but I'm not entirely clear yet that these three countries are strong allies in that sense.
Victor, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned Donald Trump and what a second potential Trump presidency may mean or may not mean going forward. I want to ask you from your perspective, what has happened in the past 24 hours when it comes to strengthening these ties between the U.S. and Japan, what that is going to mean in the immediate future for the relationship between China and the U.S.?
I think China views this 2+2 meeting in Tokyo and the resulting declaration as illegal because it violates the Constitution of Japan. And it may even violate the conditions upon which Japan unconditionally surrendered to China in 1945. Therefore, China is watching the development very closely. And the distinguished Japanese panelist mentioned the pacifist constitution in Japan. Let me ask us why Japan had this pacifist constitution, because it unconditionally surrendered. It was forced upon Japan, and Japan is prohibited from launching any war of aggression in perpetuity. So don't think about tinkering with the Constitution, because no one will allow that. Countries like China will never allow Japan to reconstitute its constitution to enable wars of aggression by Japan again in this part of the world. Japan should permanently remain as a pacifist country, as the conditions upon which Japan unconditionally surrendered back in 1945, period. If the United States urges Japan in the wrong direction, the United States will be held responsible. And Japan, if it follows the US leadership in venturing out of its country with its military troops, it will again be dealt with as such. Look at the United Nations Charter. There are provisions to prevent Japan and Germany, which unconditionally surrendered in 1945, from exactly doing this. Therefore, we should remember what history is. I think Japan will always be welcomed as a peaceful nation, as a nation bent upon developing peaceful relations with its neighboring countries, rather than raising its militaristic head again to threaten its neighboring countries, especially to threaten countries like China, to which Japan unconditionally surrendered. Period. I hope this will be the end of discussion about Japan.
Tomohiko, the joint statement after the announcement, it reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to extended deterrence, which includes nuclear weapons. That was once off limits for Japan. How big a shift is that?
The coverage of nuclear weapons over Japan has been here in place for decades. There is nothing new about that. What's happened today is to make sure that the nuclear deterrence, extended deterrence, is going to be there even more in the future. Now, responding to Mr. Gao's curious allegation, Japan made a surrender to the party of the Allied powers, to which Chinese Communist Party was no part. And when Japanese Prime Minister made a rapprochement in 1972, and the Prime Minister went to China, Chairman Mao said, of course half-jokingly, that the Japanese Imperial military did a great service to the Chinese Communist Party because the Kuomintang Party was the enemy number one for Chinese Communist Party at the time. So you cannot have a one-sided interpretation of history. Now, if I may repeat, China is the only country in the human history that has grown its defense budget 35 times. No nation in the history of mankind has done anything like that in peacetime. And Chinese defense budget now is 5.4 times as large as Japan's. And China has not made everything transparent. So China may be spending even more than that. So I do wish that the borders, the dividing line between China and Japan, China and the Philippines, and China and Indonesia, and so on, stay and remain tranquil, as Mr. Gao said, about the land border between Russia and China. But the thing, the fact of the matter is, Chinese have been pushing envelope all directions, to Japan, to the Senkakus, to the Philippines, and to the Vietnam, and so on and so forth.
Evan, it looked to me like you were reacting to some of what Tomohiko was saying there. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a key point there, which is whatever regional security tension we now see, it is certainly not without cause. It is certainly not happening without a vacuum. I do think that China should not underestimate the concern and the perception among regional countries, including Japan, but also India, also Southeast Asian states, about China's lack of transparency in terms of military spending, but also in terms of its own behavior in the region. And we see this certainly in the Philippines over the past year, but that's not an isolated incident with the Philippines. China has its own issues with India since Galwan 2020. Yes, things have been relatively quiet with Vietnam, but in the past, there were certainly high tension and even conflict with Vietnam. So I do think that the history of the region is certainly replete with great powers behaving in a way that creates the impressions of threat and concern. So I do not think it's particularly productive to sideline these concerns altogether and blame it entirely on the United States, because I do think one very important piece of concern for everyone in the region is agency and autonomy and the need to define and defend its own interests and its own concerns. So I do think we should not be assigning a particular motive to other countries like the United States and others as if these regional countries do not have their own agency and autonomy.
And Evan, we only have about a minute and a half left, but let me just ask you, is all this going to allow the U.S. to further strengthen relationships with other allies in the region?
I think the allies part, certainly, yes. There's a momentum building up, and Washington is certainly going to push that momentum further with South Korea, with Australia, with Japan, and yes, with the Philippines as well. But as I said earlier, that momentum is certainly now starting to move into difficult terrain like technological sharing, cybersecurity, information and intelligence sharing, interoperability. So there are a whole host of alliance management and issues that are far from being resolved, but the momentum is heading that way. The challenge for me is not on the alliance side, because I think it's going very well for now, but whether or not the non-alliance part of the security partnerships with countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others can build and have that same momentum. That's the part that I haven't really seen. It seems as if Washington is basically saying, the train is moving, you either jump on or hop off, but we're moving ahead with our alliances in the future. So I do think this is creating a sense of uncertainty and concern among the rest of the region outside of U.S. alliance.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Victor Gao, Tomohiko Taniguchi, and Evan Laxmana. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.